pleasure of chairing this panel, which will be concerned with the following question, which is the new Europe different? And before I make some preliminary comments and introduce our speakers, let me thank our host, the Graduate Institute, the Institute for Human Sciences, and our gracious host, André Liebig, my good friend. We have three distinguished speakers whom I will introduce in a minute, but maybe just a word on the topic itself and this angle for the second session. The question of the current evolution of the European continent is not solely confined to matters of limits, capacity, as have been already discussed, or the economy, which would be matters of performance, one could say, which was also examined. It arguably also encompasses an increasingly feature present in this discussion, which is the notion of mutation, of transformation, one would say, of the landscape, of the identity landscape, of the perception landscape, the socio-political dimensions as such. A possible shift in this discussion would therefore be the question of composition, of face, in other words, as such. Self-understanding comes to mind, and I am sure my colleagues will also address this question of matters of perception and identity always meet at the crossroads of self-perception. A recent issue of Time magazine, which is always a bellwether of perceptions, featured in its cover a family of, I will say, for shorthand purposes, non-European, ethnically, initially at least, immigrants with the caption, "The New Europeans." And that was pretty arresting. I think it was a revealing statement in terms of the rise of this discussion and possibly its urgency in certain places. So is the new Europe actually different? And what does it mean to be different? And if so, how? And what does it mean in relation to earlier experiences of transformation that we have had? Finally, what would be the possible explanations of such shifts, if there is such a shift? Non-change could also be possibly an argument. So to help us tackle these questions and related questions, I'm delighted to welcome three colleagues here, three distinguished colleagues. To my immediate left, Professor Valeria Korabliovia from the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev. Professor Korabliovia also has been a visiting fellow at the University of Warsaw, also a fellow at IWM, previously at Stanford. You taught at Karazin Kharkiv National University. She published a number of works, most recently Social Senses of Ideology. Thank you for being with us. To my far left is Professor Magdalena Nowicka-Franczask, please pardon my pronunciation, of the University of Lodz, where she teaches sociology. Also a former fellow at IWM, and she has been recently the co-editor of Discourse of the Symbolic Elites. Thank you for joining us. Finally, my colleague and dear friend, Professor André Liebig, who is honorary professor here at the Graduate Institute of International History and Politics. He is also a former fellow at IWM. His distinguished professorship took him to places such as Quebec, Montreal, McGill, Fribourg, St. Anthony's, Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton, among other places. He's published extensively. I will simply mention for this discussion his reference book on les minorités nationales en Europe centrale et orientale. Thank you, André, for convening this conference. Thank you for being with us. We will proceed without further ado with Professor Korabliovia, 20 minutes each, question and answers following that.
Thank you so much to the organizers and to Professor Liebig for the invitation. It's a pleasure and a great honor to be here today in such a distinguished company. And I also would like to thank the organizers for framing this panel, because I believe the notion of New Europe enables me to proceed with a small wordplay, because basically what is meant here, we can interpret it diversely. Of course, I understand that it's a sort of politically correct notion for labeling sort of what used to be called Eastern Europe. And then a short answer would be, yes, it is different. And the cleavage nowadays is crucial for understanding the recent developments of the EU. But what is even more important in my view is that it has to be treated differently. And what I mean here, that is sort of what in the post-colonial theory is called epistemological hegemony of the West has to be overcome, or what Spivak calls even epistemic violence. Then whatever happens in this part of the continent is of less importance, and it does not contribute significantly to the understanding of the whole project. So my take today is not to focus on this region and try to describe its peculiarity, but rather to disclose a certain Eastern standpoint on the EU project and on the situation in Europe in general. And from this point, I'm trying to figure the question like that. If we can think that New Europe is not only something determined topologically, geographically, but something that can be interpreted historically or chronologically, that nowadays social and political landscape in Europe has been changing so significantly that we can say that new Europe is emerging right now. So I'm trying to address the question, what new Europe is currently emerging and what's the role of the new Europe or Central Eastern Europe within this process? That's my version of visualizing what's going on right now, what Juncker calls polycrisis. I believe that one of the most important cleavages nowadays is between national interests and European interests. Nowadays, they're oftentimes perceived as contrary to one another, and that's why the EU is under threat of its disappearing or being significantly reconfigured, and what I tend to call a multi-parochial rather than multipolar world. And here I want to introduce a very peculiar notion to this discussion, namely the notion of utopia, using the quote by George Steiner, who once said, "There are times in which utopia is the only realism." So in a way, I will try to discuss the domain of ideas with you, what's happening with the idea of Europe and what's happening with the utopia. And maybe it's time to think if any alternative positive vision of the future of Europe is still possible, what I tentatively call alt-Euro optimism, obviously referring to alt-right, which got to the short list of the words of the year, labeling that the ideological landscape is changing. I also owe you a preliminary remark, what I am trying to talk about. And here I use the concept of a colleague of mine, a Ukrainian colleague. That's part of my job here today, to introduce to you Eastern thinkers on the issue. So here is one of them, a Ukrainian philosopher, Volodymyr Yermolenko, who says that there are two Europes. Europe of institutions, and here Brussels would be a watchword, and here we understand how this vague idea of Europe has been implemented, and we are discussing what can be improved, if any. And on the other hand, we have Europe of ideas, and here modernity would be a key word, so a sort of underlying big vision behind the real institutional configuration. A sort of regulative idea. Of course, they do not exist completely separately because they are intertwined, and when we introduce some new institutions, we have some vision behind it, and they are, of course, connected. And today I will focus precisely on the second dimension, on the idea of Europe. Therefore, the outline of my presentation, it would be structured in two parts. One would be following the idea of Ivan Krastev that what's happening nowadays is a European counter-revolution. I will try to think together with you, why is it a counter-revolution, counter to what revolution it is, and why 1989 is a turning point for the EU project. A short disclaimer would be that what we discussed in the previous panel, that precisely the goal of the EU initially was that it was a trade economic union which is aimed at, guided by the idea of maintaining peace of the continent. And obviously the agenda has changed, but there is a feeling that the methods have not changed. And therefore, the EU was re-established, or at least there was an attempt to re-establish the EU as a polity, but still economic measures and institutional arrangements dominate. And the second part of my presentation, what I call the Russian proposal, of course I'm biased here, but don't get me wrong, so I'm talking about this idea of dismantling European universalism with a sort of promoting what is called the right-wing international, the alt-right international, or what Professor Müller yesterday described as populism, the rise of populism in the world. So, starting with European counter-revolution, in the recent interview to Die Presse, Ivan Krastev said that there is no revolution in Europe without a counter-revolution. And of course it was very catchy that the results of the US elections were announced on the same day, which was the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I believe it's a very good metaphor, because a visual embodiment of the revolution of 1989 was the fall of the wall, a sort of the claim for openness, overcoming boundaries, and a plea for universalism. And what's happening nowadays within this rise of populism is again erecting walls. Viktor Orban claimed that we have to build a wall to protect the country from the influx of refugees, and Donald Trump made it one of parts of his program again to build a wall with Mexico. So definitely it is a very powerful metaphor which says something more. So I think, yes, okay, let's accept the idea that it's plausible that it's a sort of counter-revolution. Then what is the revolution it counters? And probably we have to reassess the event of 1989, and of course I don't mean the exact year, but what is the whole bunch of implications behind it. This very famous Fukuyamian trope of the end of history, so basically the main part of the argument of Francis Fukuyama was that we had three different visions of modernity of Europe, of modernization of Europe, whatever you prefer, and two of them failed dramatically, and only liberalism left as a viable option, and therefore it is the victory of the liberal doctrine, and what's going to happen? It's basically expansion of liberalism, territorial expansion over different countries, because there are no other alternatives. I would claim that what is happening is precisely the opposite. Since we claim that by saying Europe as a modern project, we imply liberalism, we link the two together, and what used to be perceived as a sort of general consensus, as shared values like openness, democracy, rule of law, nowadays was squeezed only to the liberal vision, which has alternatives, which can be questioned. So instead of expansion, we have shrinking the space of what used to be considered common. And I think that liberals are not ready to accept the changing circumstances. And what is even more important, that by criticizing liberalism, we at the same time take it as a legal ground, as a valid ground for undermining the whole project of the United Europe. If liberalism, and a very particular one, neoliberalism, has failed, it means that the whole project of United Europe is under question, because you yourself claim that there are no other visions for Europe. What about liberalism? I think one of the problems that it degraded into two domains. On one hand, to technoliberalism, and on another hand, to neoliberalism. So many people talking about liberalism keep in mind rather economic liberalism rather than political one, and therefore all this discourse of losers of globalization is there. But technoliberalism is very important, and it brings me to the idea of utopia, because here I don't quite agree with Professor Müller that it has the same structure of discourse, that it's too monolithic the same way as the populism, but I would rather say that what precisely was done is closing the temporal dimension of future. So what was claimed first by Daniel Bell as early as the 1960s, that we can imagine no better future. So our destiny is to live in this continuing present. And what Fukuyama said, so basically no other developments. And then when the situation changed and that the present stopped to be that satisfactory, the idea that future is dreadful was still there. And what, for example, Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht calls our broad present, he says that the future is so dreadful that the only destiny we have is only to reproduce the same, or, as another option, which is now on stage, is to instead to appeal to the past and to establish some sort of reactive answers, reactive responses, that if the present is not satisfactory, then we should look back to the past and try to reverse the development. So that's the general landscape, which somehow explains in a way why populism reached out quite easily to the audience. So it's not only about the message itself, but also about the recipients, why they were eager to get new ideas, alternative answers, alternative visions. So basically, yes, of course, the financial crisis, this sort of elephant in the room of 2008, which revealed that the present is not that satisfactory, pushed some people to think what other options are there. And maybe I overestimated the role of Russia, but I think anyway it's important to take a closer look to understand a broader perspective. And here I suggest you a quote from a recent publication in New York Times, where one of the representatives of American conservatives said that Mr. Putin's Russia was the template for us. Intellectually, they've shown us how it works. So precisely in the domain of ideas, it is publicly recognized as a model to emulate. That's why at least it's worth a closer look. The Russian proposal. Facing the challenge of the failed promise of prosperity, of course it's a big issue, because one of the speakers on the previous panel said that the promise of prosperity was kept actually, but for a limited number of people and countries to some extent. And that's why expanding this space of prosperity puts very uneasy questions. And some people like Ugo Matei, they say that, so he tries to link economy and ecology, and he says that you cannot guarantee the space of prosperity on the Western level for the whole world. So either you protect the boundaries between the prosperity and the poverty, or you have to decrease in your expectations to make this sort of change in the mindset, kind of shifting from prosperity to sustainability or whatever. But there is another option. You can compensate the lack of prosperity with the feeling of being innate to something great. And here comes a magic formula: make X great again, make America great again, make Russia or Poland or whatever you can put there. Then you embrace a local community, and then you have this feeling that all suffering matters because you have a high goal. Politics of anger. Instead of rational discussions, instead of trying to take a look at arguments and sort of logical argumentation, no, instead you channelize emotions, and usually by picking scapegoats. So you're just channelizing the resentment, and to some extent it works. As I said, discreditation, moral discreditation of the opponent, rather than trying to argue, to invent some arguments against his claims. Here comes the post-truth world and reversible modernity. Okay, what I want to say here, that again, Ivan Krastev, since this conference is co-organized by IWM, I have some grounds to quote my colleague from IWM. He once said that recent US elections were a sign of Europeanization of the American politics, this sort of radicalization or antagonistic politics which was not there before, but now it's there. And I would add that this sort of Europeanization is to some extent, to a large extent, arguably by the Eastern European template. So we could be skeptical about developments in Hungary, Poland, but after Brexit and Trump, the situation is a bit different. And here I want to bring, I think I don't have enough time, but if you got interested, I hope for some questions about that. Interestingly enough, in Soviet times, two scholars working in a seemingly safe domain, namely cultural semiotics, they invented a theory distinguishing between binary and ternary discourses. And it works for these situations because first of all, they overtly claim that number one, binary type is inherent in Russia throughout its history. So one binary discourse has been completely, totally replaced with another, and that's how the history goes. And they themselves counterpose, I mean Lotman and Uspensky, they oppose it to the Western template, Western European culture, which is ternary. And I believe it's important to understand because what's going on right now is precisely an attempt to restructure the dominant political discourse in Europe, to change a ternary discourse to a binary one. And that's why it's important how they interact between one another and what is the danger there. So my take here is that it's not about the content of the ideology or of the message, but rather about the whole structure of the discourse. If we change the rules, if we change the structure, then it gets inertial, then it's very hard to backslide to the previous one. So to simplify the situation, I think you can get it from here that binary structure suggests a very black and white vision of the world. And there are no neutral elements. So you have to choose the side either way. And it's very esoteric, it's closed. It does not react to any facts. It has not to be proven by reality. So you have a number of axioms, a sort of canon, which is there. Accept it or leave it, then you are marginal, then you are not part of the people or whatever. It's very stable, but for sustainability it has to be autarkic, it has to be closed. And the second structure, ternary, it does not have clear-cut boundaries. It is very plastic, it is changeable in time, it includes all the alternatives, and it can easily include this one as part of the discourse, but for common discussion. What is important here is the rules that have to be, so that's sort of comparing the two. And this sort of ternary culture, or ternary discourse tends to expansion. And his strong point is that any critique leads to advancement, to self-improvement on the model, and binary culture has to be completely replaced. So this is the history with ruptures. And probably I ran out of time. I have to stop here, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being concise and on time. I think you raised quite a number of points, taking us into what you described as the original revolution that had to be countered and the manners in which different proposals, including the last one that you covered, was articulating a logic of at least, if not displacement, sitting in an alignment, which I think is very interesting for the next discussion as such. So we move next to our speaker, which is Professor Novika Francesc. Please, the floor is yours.
No. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure for me to talk to you on the differences between the new and the old Europe in the face of political change in the continent. Still, I would argue, just as Valeria did, maybe even more stronger, that the concept of New Europe is a substantial part of the problem we discussed today. From a Central and Eastern European perspective, the term New Europe seems essentially contradictory, since being a part of Europe in its political and cultural dimension was always and still is an undebatable assumption, an axiom. For this reason, I would claim that the discursive construction of Central, Eastern, or Southeastern European other as a younger, immature member of the family is one of the sources of the current discrepancy in the self-understanding of Europe as a coherent entity. There are two major ways of facing this intra-European othering. On the one hand, you can conduct yourself as a diligent student of democratization processes who tries to prove that there is actually no significant difference between the old and new Europe. In particular, this strategy has been applied by left liberal elites in Central and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, you can celebrate the ascribed difference subversively and introduce a kind of strategic counter-othering of Western Europeans with the aim to renegotiate the hierarchical order of European societies. This renegotiating of order, forced mainly by right-wing or left-wing populism, opens up too easily, however, to nationalistic or xenophobic discourse and causes unintended consequences. Namely, the more independently and self-sufficiently a society wants to act in the world based off interdependence and multitude, the more parochial, bizarre, or exotic a self-image it produces. Summing up the tension between the center and the periphery embedded in European discourse has led to a gradual reluctance in the so-called New Europe towards chosen aspects of European integration considered in a wider historical context. There is no coincidence that it is Central and Eastern Europe where for 2 decades post-colonial theory has been vigorously developed in order to reveal the relation of subjection between the West and the East of Europe, as well as the colonizing experience between the societies in this region, like the Poles and Ukrainians, for instance. Interestingly, the post-colonial critique is extensively used also in a manner strictly instrumental by conservative politicians in Eastern and Central Europe as a justification of very Eurosceptic conservative policy. For example, Jarosław Kaczyński, the leader of the ruling party in Poland, Law and Justice, and in fact the eminence grise of the Polish authorities, delights in calling EU bureaucracy a post-colonial system and in ascribing a post-colonial mentality to Euro-enthusiastic opposition in Poland. My esteemed colleagues has already discussed the political, economic, and cultural layer of the crisis of European self-understanding. I would like to emphasize one more aspect, namely the symbolic and also the discursive foundations of mistrust and even hostility in intra-European relations. I believe that discourse studies, analysis of public debate, rhetoric, and argumentation strategies can show us quite a few interesting things about the causes of the current rise of illiberal populist tendencies and the wave of xenophobia in post-socialist democracies. Firstly, old Europe growing disillusionment with the new members of the EU is linked to the exhaustion of post-Kantian rhetoric of immaturity, directed at the so-called New Europe by Western elites and left liberal domestic elites. Boris Budan calls this rhetorical figure the repressive infantilization of nations who, despite proving their political maturity in their non-violent divorce from communism, are supposed to learn the democratic modus operandi from scratch and to liberate themselves from their alleged post-communist mentality. In this narrative, the communist period is regarded as non-history, and only 1989 marks the political birth of eastern part of Europe. This rhetoric has accompanied the process of transition from the beginning and was uncritically accepted by a vast majority of the leaders of the transition. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of spending some time at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna as Bronisław Geremek Junior Visiting Fellow. The patron of this fellowship, Bronisław Geremek, a Polish historian and liberal politician, and one of the designers of transition in Poland, once articulated a phrase very symptomatic for the rhetoric of immaturity. In 1990, after the first round of presidential election in Poland, when Stan Tymiński, an unknown outsider with a populist program, came second, Geremek said, "The Poles aren't grown up enough for democracy." Although it was only in 2015 when the victory of populist politics came a reality, today using the rhetoric of immaturity in Poland or other countries in the region is communicational and political suicide. In other words, after 25 years of democratic change, a growing number of Central and Eastern Europeans do not want to be taught anymore how to form democracy, and patronizing elitist argumentation seems nothing but a fuel for the radicals. My point is not to defend illiberal tendencies or advocate populism of any kind. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the strategy of shaming directed at the so-called New Europe has become a counterproductive device which can make international communication even worse. Nonetheless, observing the Western European debates, I have the impression that the rhetoric of immaturity is very resistant to critique, since it functions as a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more New Europe rejects the supposed role of the unexperienced cousin, the more immature it appears to the view of the external protagonists. Secondly, for a couple of years, we have seen a symbolic bankruptcy of the neoliberal alternative and the dismissal of pro-Western scenario of imitative democratic transition in Europe. There already exists many analyses of the economic and political causes of social disenchantment with neoliberalism, and I don't want to repeat them. My intention is, however, to emphasize one particular consequence of the downfall of the neoliberal narrative. The conservative parties like Fidesz and Law and Justice had profited immensely from the public exploitation of weaknesses and contradiction of the neoliberal project, but they proved to be incapable of offering any alternative narrative that could be acceptable for the majority of people. As long as the EU performed smoothly, the lack of such a collective discourse didn't constitute any serious problem, but this time is over now. Thirdly, from the perspective of discourse studies, democratic transition in Central and Eastern Europe is not an accomplished fact, but a subject of constant dispute. However, the debate on transition and its outcomes reveals more differences than parallels between the Polish, Czech, Hungarian, and Slovakian public understanding of Europe. For instance, the pragmatic and secular orientation in Hungarian, Czech, and to some extent in Slovakian political discourse usually translate into evaluating transition in economic terms and in constructing a sharp social division between the winners and the losers of capitalism. From this point of view, the non-secular political discourse in Poland, in which the economic inequalities are moralized on the basis of chosen aspects of Catholic morals, allegedly threatened by EU policy, this discourse may seem completely misguided and bizarre. Another demarcation line lies between the Czech public debate, who's focused on the present political fight, and Polish or Hungarian political discourse, whose crucial dimension is reinventing of glorious past of the nation. And the first victim of such an operation on the history is usually the attachment to Europe itself. This historical bias in Polish and Hungarian public debate may result from the lack of ceremonial closure of the communist era, the lack of a dramatically staged rite of passage, and unfinished decommunization process. The impossibility of what Jan Kubik and Emil Lynch call mnemonic reconciliation with the compromising shape of transition leads to the delegitimization of liberal democratic order by particular social groups, but definitely not by post-socialist societies as a whole. In the Western media, Central and Eastern Europeans are often represented as invariable monolithic entities. In fact, the ongoing settling of accounts with the transition is producing a divergence of opinions and values, and the strength of European identities seems to be a litmus test of the deep social split. For the remaining couple of minutes, I would like to focus on Poland, my homeland, until recently perceived as a leader of democratization and economic change in the region, but today probably seen as the greatest disappointment in the eyes of our Western partners. In 2015, both presidential and parliamentary elections in Poland were won by Law and Justice, the then biggest opposition party, with a conservative ideological program, national perspective in European politics, and social approach in economics. To put it briefly, a party of a new hybrid type, which goes beyond the traditional division between the right and the left, and which articulates radical slogans when it is beneficial to the party. However, on the level of its hierarchical structure and clumsy use of new media, Law and Justice may be perceived as an anachronistic coterie. For this reason, I would claim that instead of wondering why this particular party took it all in Poland, we should ask what kind of political vision attracted people. This vision is also a highly hybrid project, partially embedded in parochial modes of political thinking, partially in the promise of self-contained policy, but first and foremost connected with the collective desire of not being patronized anymore. And the first victim of this desire were migrants from the Middle East, who were not only stigmatized as barbarians or suspected terrorists, but also associated with the EU's attempt at moral blackmail directed at the so-called New Europe. And in fact, Law and Justice tips its scale in favor thanks to the mixture of Islamophobia and the fantasy of punishing Europe for its unwanted instructions. You cannot, though, exploit one single fantasy all the time. Therefore, the ruling party in Poland manufactures an exemplary postmodern political discourse, which contains both a technocratic demand for modernization and economic growth, pre-modern religious symbolism, conspiracy theories, and simulacra representing post-factual narratives. The notion of post-truth or post-fact introduced in the American context by Ralph Keyes and by Peter Pomerantsev in the Russian context has already been declared Word of the Year by Oxford Dictionaries. However, Pomerantsev diagnosis doesn't entirely suit the Polish case, since Law and Justice tries to legitimize its political discourse as an undisputable truth within the Catholic ontology. For instance, you probably haven't heard that on November 19th this year, the Catholic Church in Poland, in the presence of the President Andrzej Duda, proclaimed Jesus Christ as King and Lord in Poland. Well, the current drama of Polish democracy consists of failures of the liberal opposition, who during the 8 years of governing failed to build exological bonds with the European community, and today the ruling party uses these failures to introduce its authoritarian and self-isolation policy. Another aspect of this drama is that any objection made by EU partners, though very much needed today, can be easily dismissed as an attempt of hostile interference. What might curb this illiberal revolution in Poland today is, in my view, the internal conflicts in the heart of Law and Justice, or the new wave of social protests, which actually has been accompanying the government since the first months of its rule. And in the very end, I would like to come back to the question of our discussion: is the new Europe different? And I would insist that the answer should be ambiguous. As for the current dynamics of political change and populist drift, there is no fundamental qualitative difference between the new Europe and the rest, especially after Brexit, the presidential elections in the USA, or the referendum in Italy. Moreover, claiming that all societies labeled as Central, Eastern, or Southeastern Europe are drifting in the same direction is an unjustified simplification, taking into consideration, for instance, a dramatically different attitude towards Russia in Polish or Hungarian or Bulgarian foreign policy. However, it is possible to point to a substantial particularity of the New Europe in regard to the symbolic layer of resentments, the vitality of the traditional concept of the nation as an integrating empty signifier, and the collective feeling of historical injustice, which put the societies in the region in the position of inferior actors who have to, metaphorically speaking, return to Europe after the communist period, although they always considered themselves an essential part of European entity. So if we want to make a step further towards pan-European communication, we should acknowledge the historical and conceptual difference, but without rendering it absolute in any way. As a closing remark, I would like to recall a thought by a late Polish philosopher, Leszek Kołakowski, that once we doubt in our freedom within Europe, we demean ourselves beyond any doubt. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your nuanced and response to the question. There's many takeaways in what you presented. I think you built up quite nicely on Professor Harablouviaz's presentation. I'll highlight maybe 2 points which I think were very striking for me. One is that the sense of reaction to the crisis, if there is a crisis, is not only what we find traditionally in the disenchantment of transitions, but also this reaction to what you spoke about as this infantilizing discourse, which is also self-reinforcing in many ways, which dismisses other positions as such. The second point, which I thought was very interesting, what you started with initially, the possibility of positioning one along a continuum and therefore using strategically the reaction to this and borrowing from other prisms such as the post-colonial one, or simply inserting it, not borrowing it necessarily. I'm sure we can come back to those points as well. Many thanks. So we move now to our third speaker, Professor Liebig. André, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Let me begin by thanking Mahmoud for chairing this panel. Mahmoud has just stepped off a transatlantic flight and he has postponed a class that he is giving, and yet he seems to be full of freshness and ardor as ever. I hope not to keep you here very long, at the risk perhaps of stating what I have to say more brutally than I would otherwise. My intervention is organized in three parts. First, I want to suggest some historical differences between the old and the new Europe. Let me state that I should have perhaps put New Europe in inverted commas as an ironic expression, since it was initially used by someone whom few of us admire, Donald Rumsfeld, and the distinction corresponds to what used to be called Western and Eastern Europe, but which of course is no longer a current term. What I want to propose is that there are differences that precede or are independent of the communist domination of Eastern Europe that distinguish the new Europe from the old Europe. And I'll talk about these differences initially. The second point I want to make is about the illusions that the new Europe may have had and may still have to some extent about the European project, particularly as incarnated in the European Union. And my third point is that I propose to draw conclusions from what I will have said and to answer positively in my case, not ambiguously, the question posed in the title to the panel: is the new Europe different? So, obviously, old Europe, meaning the original members of what was the European Common Market, then the European Community, and finally the European Union, as well as outliers such as Switzerland and Norway, and then those who joined the Brussels-centered Europe before the former countries of the Soviet bloc did, they all indeed live in a different world. To take one example, Spain, roughly the same size as Poland, had in 1950 an equivalent GNP. Today, even though Poland is reputed to have soared and Spain is in the doldrums, Spain's per capita GNP is still twice that of Poland. My point, though, is that the differences between the old and the new Europe cannot be imputed only to communist domination. I did have a PowerPoint here.
You should be able to. Let me set it up.
Yes, thank you.
I'm just gonna get it for you. It should be right here.
Okay, yes. Has it appeared? No.
He's gonna make it appear.
Okay, good. So, to repeat myself, my point is that the differences between the old and the new Europe cannot be imputed only to communist domination. First, a very significant part of the West European experience, past and even to some extent present, is that of overseas empires. Post-colonial rhetoric has become quite fashionable in the new Europe, as we have heard.
I just need to set this up. If you can just let me say.
Yes, thank you. It's still not on, yes?
No, it's not. The gentleman. Could you
Yes,
please
okay. We will answer. I only have 2 slides, don't worry, so it's not really essential to what I'm saying. But the point I want to make is that Eastern Europe, or the New Europe, has not possessed overseas colonies as most countries in Western Europe have. Voilà. Okay. This is, I think, a very fundamental difference, and one which undermines the post-colonial paradigm that we have been hearing about. Second, it is striking that in the New Europe, there is only one official language at the state level. a language which is not official anywhere else. I think I should move on to the next one. Yes. I think this reflects a very strong feeling that in the new Europe, one believes that the state belongs to, quote, us, to the majority, which has toiled hard and suffered much to finally make the state its own, without the minorities which made life so difficult for the majority in the past and which do not really belong. There may be similar feelings deep down in Western Europe, but they are rarely expressed as bluntly or as brazenly, at least not by the right people. This constitutes, I think, a significant difference between the two parts of Europe. The old Europe celebrates, or at least pays lip service to diversity. For instance, in the old Europe, official bilingualism or even trilingualism is the rule at a national level. This may be made easier by the fact that each national language has official currency outside the borders of the state in which it originates. This is not the case for any of the new Europe states. I shall draw conclusions from these differences at the end of my intervention. For the moment, let me pass on to illusions about the European project and the EU in particular. The European Common Market was created as a capitalist cartel. This is why leftist parties throughout Western Europe long remained cool with regard to this project. Yes, the European project did serve to reconcile France and Germany, but this was done mainly through the American pressure, banging heads together. The French were certainly not keen to forget the humiliations of the past that Germany had inflicted upon them. With time, Europe, meaning the EU, wove a self-regarding narrative about itself as a kinder, gentler world. It could do so snugly ensconced as it was under a NATO umbrella, and before economic crisis hit it hard in the early years of the century. When the other Europe, those countries that had been safely relegated to the Soviet sphere, appealed to the EU in the name of their common Europeanness after 1989, Brussels was rather embarrassed and put off accession as long as it could, putting up hoops and hurdles, elements of conditionality that were rightly seen as hypocritical delaying tactics. So what is the outcome of all this? The new Europe, both new EU members and those aspiring to become such, do not share the guilty conscience of much of the West, particularly intellectuals, with regard to the post-colonial world and to the sins of the past. East Europeans don't need to seek out victims elsewhere. They consider themselves victims of a double totalitarianism, first Nazi and then communist. They have always considered themselves Europeans. They cannot understand why Brussels did not open wide its arms to them at the very first opportunity. They believe in Europe, of course, but they also believe in their nation state, whose sovereignty or whose very existence has been so recently and so arduously acquired. They find the cosmopolitanism of the West, its multilingualism and its multiculturalism baffling. It is an affront to the very identity. For these reasons, the new Europe, which used to be called Eastern Europe, meaning those countries of the former Soviet bloc and former Soviet Union that have joined the EU and those that aspire to join it, are indeed different from the core old Europe nestled in the western part of the continent. Those who urge the West to integrate in the eastern part of the continent within itself on the presumption that the West's self-proclaimed values would percolate eastwards along with its superior economic powers, must now acknowledge that the opposite may be happening, as has been already suggested. The East has to be sure become more Western. There are Pradas and H&M boutiques everywhere. But the West has also become more Eastern, as populism, national primacy, and anti-liberalism has gathered strength in the West as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. You left us hanging there. I think we were expecting even more. You were going on with your very insightful analysis, and I hope that we can pick up more your brains in the Q&A. Again, much to take away, I think the self-regarding nature of Western Europe initially in this convenient narrative of old before the crisis hits, I think is an important point, because in many ways it reveals us the problems that we're seeing today and the urgency in waking up to that convenience. The tensions between the two sides, or different perceptions, and the equity of the local for at least Eastern Europe. Probably for the other side, maybe now, I think, borrowing, as you said, from the second phase that we're examining today. So many thanks for all of this to all three of you. So we have a lot on the table, and I'll open the floor now. We'll take questions in batches of 2 and 3, go back to the panelists, and we have about 25 minutes, half an hour. Floor is open. Please, madam.
Good morning. Is it okay?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, my thanks go to the organizers of this event, and I would like to also warmly welcome Madame Korobleva from Taras Shevchenko National University, as I represent Ukrainian mission here in Geneva. Thank you very much for your presentation. As we are intensively speaking about Eastern and Central Europe here, I cannot but take this opportunity to ask our distinguished speakers, how do you see the role and the place of Ukraine in Europe, or let's say in New Europe, in terms of dealing with the Russian aggression, and in terms of Ukraine's European inspirations and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an important dimension. We'll come back to it in a minute. Others, please. Sir, here in the front, please.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentations. I really appreciate those thoughts, and myself, I'm always struggling with those questions of liberal democracy being in decline in the new Europe. But I really appreciate the comment that it's actually the case in the old Europe as well. So my comment is rather going back to the very idea of liberal democracy, which in my view, of course I'm a lawyer, so for me it's more an institutional aspect as well as a behavioral aspect, of course. This is the core idea of Europe, and I do not think that the history of the last decades proved that there are alternatives to this liberal democracy. I do not consider neoliberalism as an alternative. I do consider it as a policy failure. And similarly, what Magdalena has said, the failure of the liberal opposition, in my view, it's not a proof of the failure of liberal democracy. It's certainly a political policy failure, but liberal democracy is still the core of Europe, should be the core of Europe, and all those attempts to formulate illiberal democracy, as the Hungarian Prime Minister famously argued that Hungary is building up a democracy which is not going to be liberal but illiberal. I do not think that there is such a thing as illiberal democracy at all. So if illiberal, it cannot be democracy. So in my sense, liberal democracy and democracy as itself is a constitutive elements of democracy is rule of law, fundamental rights, and free elections. So those countries, starting with Hungary and Poland nowadays, are not illiberal democracies. They are not democracies. They are in a different stage of being undemocratic, but they are illiberal and undemocratic in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more. The gentleman next to you, please.
Thank you for your presentations. Let me make two brief connected comments. The first one basically addresses the point that was made, but that was raised by all the three speakers. Well, the notion of new Europe, referring to Central Europe, Eastern Europe, seems to re-emerge cyclically at any given occasion. First, of course, it was after 1989, then it was before the accession of Central European countries to the European Union, and most recently, of course, with refusal of Central European countries to accept refugee quotas. And when these countries refused the Brussels plan to relocate migrants more or less proportionally to the populations of each country, NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International accused Eastern Europeans or Central Eastern Europeans of not being compassionate enough, and the reason for this lack of compassion was supposed to be lack of diversity in these countries. That because these countries were shaped after 1945 by global superpowers and there were waves of forced migrations, these countries, these societies are not used to dealing with diversity. But well, it seems that after Trump or Brexit, that even countries that which leave diversity day to day are not that capable of dealing with diversity either. So this would lead me to the point, well, maybe whatever happens in the so-called New Europe, as it was shaped, its social structure was shaped by the global superpowers after 1945. Maybe this is basically a sign of what might happen in the core. Because as we know from economy, the economic crisis usually start at the peripheries and then they move to the center. So this might be also the case of this logic. And the second point I wanted to make, which is related to this, is about reactionary politics. Maybe what we are facing, I mean, Ivan Krastev was in the interview that Valeria quoted, was also building up on Mark Lilla's recent book, The Shipwrecked Mind, in which he describes the figure of the reactionary and distinguishes between reactionary and the conservative. The reactionary is not trying to preserve, he's trying to recreate a utopia that never existed. He's trying to recreate the world that never was. And therefore his major sentiment, the sentiment that basically fuels and moves all his efforts, is nostalgia. Nostalgia as this convoluted image of the past that never was. And if we agree that we are facing reactionary politics in Eastern Europe, maybe this reactionary politics also moves closer and closer to the center. And we will face a wave of reactionary politics also in the countries in the Western Europe.
Thank you very much. So back to the panel, three questions. The role and place of Ukraine, the issue of liberalism and its complexity in terms of an anchor for these changes or not. Diversity and migration, I think you're absolutely right. I just stepped out of a plane from the United States, as Andrew has mentioned, at a place where I lived many years. I've never felt such tension societally, vividly, in the aftermath of this election. And I think to your point that you can see this even in places where diversity has been celebrated as a fact and is constitutive, in fact, of that society. And the related question of nostalgia. Maybe I'll start with you, Valeria.
Thank you for very interesting points made and for interesting questions. Am I supposed to react to all the? It's up to me. Okay. Probably I will start not with Ukraine, but thank you for your presence and for remarks. We still have to work on that and make it publicly visible, this issue. Going back to more theoretical points you were making, I do believe that all these recent developments cause two types of reaction. dramatization on one hand and normalization on another one. And I would interpret your remark, Gabor, as an attempt of normalization, that no, it's not viable, it's not going to happen, democracy cannot survive without liberalism. But democracy is being interpreted differently. It can be interpreted along the lines you suggested, but it can also be interpreted as a sort of paternalist guidance. When you construct some sort of common will of the people, which will be guaranteed by a strong father figure. And you get rid of the burden of constant choice, and then somehow it simplifies and facilitates. And it's there. And we have this recent book by Alan Ryan, a British scholar, who says precisely about these two models of democracy, which have been in Europe since ancient times, and they're still here, and he claims that the second one is similarly winning. So it's a big question to be addressed, but what I'm really against, it's about normalization. We should not think about it as a part of normal electoral cycle. We should not think that it's just a pendulum, it goes back and forth, and it will normalize eventually. As for nostalgia, Pavel, precisely, that was one of my points. If you cannot construct or imagine the future, then you are trying reconstructing or constructing the past, which is on the same level of imaginary world. You appeal to some ideals in the past, and yes, of course, I do agree that it's about the direction, because conservatives and liberals, they are still moving forward, but they want to move in different directions, whereas reactionaries want to stop the dynamics and to make this reverse gear. As about the lack of diversity, it's a very disseminated argument concerning Eastern Europe, and it's brilliant to present in your presentation in Transit Online, Andrea, where exactly you said that Easterners, people in Eastern Europe, they lack this everyday experience of diversity. That's why, because everything, unusual and unknown produces fears, and politicians do play on that. But it's not only about that, it's also about this sort of competitive martyrdom. Who suffers more? Like, we are victims of Europe, so...
Where does that come from?
Competitive martyrdom, it's from Tim Snyder. He says that precisely because one of the breaking points in the history of Europe is about the World War II. Because for Western Europe, Holocaust is kind of underlying assumption, you must accept it to be accepted to the club. And in Eastern Europe, it's as well, but we suffered not less. So, we tend to think about ourselves as victims. And so, yes, it's another complicated issue to be addressed. And finally, to go back to Ukraine. I'm not sure whether I was able to deliver this idea, but what I was trying to say is that an internal logic of the European project as a modernity project, as the project of modernity, deals with constant expansion, but not forced expansion, but kind of willing when people do accept these norms and values and they want to join this space. So this project is viable as long as it is expanding and as long as it's being transformed via crisis and via accepting new participants. But for doing so, you have to accept these changes, and you have to accept that new participants can contribute to the project. If you stop it, if you draw boundaries, then Europe transforms internally. So the main danger is not about someone conquering Europe, but about Europe changing its inner nature, transform into this binary structure, whatever. So that's the danger I am against. And precisely the Ukrainian experience is, Ukraine is important here because it's precisely a battlefield between these two models of development. Either we either we claim that the project of European modernity is still acceptable, not only for Ukraine, but for the continent, for the region in general, and then we have to take. So basically, it's kind of a litmus test for many countries and for this project. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Andrei, please. I'd like to hear from both of you on the questions, if possible. Okay, sure. Do you have a microphone there? Here, have this one, please.
All right. Three issues. First, Ukraine. Well, the European future of Ukraine, I think it looks very dim, in part because the European Union is not interested in expanding, in part because the European Union doesn't feel that Ukraine has met the conditions of membership. Now, there have been different views of this in the past. Some countries were admitted to the European Union, Greece, for instance, not because they were considered ripe for the European Union, but because it was thought that admitting them would make them ripe. This has not proven to be a valid assumption. So I hope that Ukraine will get visa-free travel through Europe very soon. It seems to be on the way. But I think it's unlikely that it will go to the next step. Even the Stabilization Association Agreement has been contested, and that's only the first step towards candidate status. I think what has happened in Ukraine since the Revolution of Dignity is that there has been a true Ukrainian consciousness, which didn't exist before. There has been a Ukrainian patriotism, which is evident, perhaps, among people we know. But it has been at the price of a significant other, the significant other being Russia, which will always be there. I mean, whether one wants to or not. America is far away. The European Union is not interested in integrating Ukraine. Russia will always be on the border. I hate to suggest to my Ukrainian friends that one should find some sort of compromise agreement, or at least modus vivendi with the great neighbor, but that seems to me to be the only solution. As for liberal democracy, which Gabor Halmai raised, yes, this was sort of the trademark of Europe for a long time. And it's true that as East Asia becomes more prosperous and so on, the mere fact that the European Union is prosperous will not be enough to distinguish it as a project. What the European Union has done in the past is that it's managed to combine social welfare of a social democratic sort with a Christian democratic option, which has worked quite well. And it has worked through liberal democracy. This seems to me to be a trademark which Europe should hold on to, and which has been threatened, I admit, by the expansion of the Union. One of the problems of the European Union is that people seem to feel that it's like a bicycle. You have to keep pedaling in order to stay afloat. You have to keep expanding in order to make it viable. This has proven to be problematic, and perhaps people are prepared to fall off the bicycle now by not admitting new members. But in the last few years, the European Union has transformed into something which Jan Zielonka has called Europe as empire, meaning the European Union as a neo-imperial project. The whole idea of the Eastern Partnership with dependencies outside Europe, countries which will never become members but are in some way connected to Europe in a dependent way, makes it seem as if neo-imperialism has in fact triumphed in the European Union. That may be one of the reasons, one of many reasons, there are many others, why the Russian perspective on the European Union has changed so radically. In the past, Russia was more or less indifferent to countries joining the European Union as opposed to NATO, to which it was always opposed. In the last few years, it has become equally opposed to countries joining the European Union because, I think, of this transformation of its nature. Diversity. It's not so much that Eastern Europe doesn't have the experience of diversity. It has. It had terrific diversity, but it had a very bad experience of diversity. In other words, diversity was a factor preventing the creation of nation states, and it all ended very badly with mass murder and expulsion. This is the sort of heritage that is kept in mind and to which I really don't have an answer.
Thank you very much for all the questions and remarks. I would like to add short, brief comments to all the three questions. As for the vision of the place of Ukraine in the European Union, I would just mention the Polish perspective, and I'm afraid that in the Polish political discourse, the Ukrainian case was and still is used in a strictly instrumental manner, although in 2014 a huge number of Poles developed a truly emotional attachment and sympathy for the Ukrainians, but it was in 2014. And now we are busy with our internal conflicts and problems. As for the politicians, no matter if we talk about the current government or the former one, Ukrainian case was always a kind of excuse for controversial decisions, for decision to refuse refugees from Middle East because hundreds or million, as the prime minister, as the current prime minister claimed once, Ukrainians are already in Poland. And also, I think that in 2014 or even earlier in 2006, supporting Ukrainian revolution produced a very pleasant feeling of being a kind of West for more Eastern Europeans. So if I said that there was always this instrumental use of Ukrainian case, I mean also the symbolic dimension of this use. As for the question of illiberal democracy, I totally agree that this term illiberal democracy is fundamentally contradictory. And me personally, I would agree that it's very hard to imagine non-liberal democracy. But I would argue that one of the greatest failures of the liberal and left liberal elites in the so-called New Europe consisted of such a phenomenon that in the public debate we stopped to distinguish between the liberalism as a profoundly axiological project and neoliberalism as strongly directed at economy, and both the elites and both the society started to identify liberalism with neoliberalism. And this, for me, very essential project, a collection of values gathered in liberal tradition, was wasted because of this argumentation and this vague usage of the concept of liberalism and neoliberalism. Yes, I would also agree with Paweł that the factor of diversity or the lack of diversity is not a condition sine qua non concerning the decisions of accepting or refusing refugees in a given society. But I'm not pretty sure if we can say that that the Eastern European logic of this refusal is now followed by other societies, because in this region the problem of refugees nowadays is rather is a phantom. So what we are really discussing, we are discussing just alleged threats and this lack of experience resulted in that if we want to justify this decision of refusing refugees, we cannot resort to our own experiences, but we also, politicians almost always name some cases of violence from Germany or other neighboring countries. So the whole, I think that this whole discussion about refugees nowadays is a discussion on empty signifiers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magdalena. One of the other ways to think about this notion of illiberal democracy that you raised, sir, is not, as you well know, an end state, but it comes to mind a work that we just finished a book with Andre on transitions, and most of the talk on illiberal democracy or these grayish areas, and there's a lot of work on that in the early 2000s, can also be conceived as a phase, as a moment in this large transition that the region is going through, as opposed to an end state, which I think would be, and I would agree with you, contradictory, because you cannot have a sense of democracy if you have those elements. We have time for one short round. I'll take 2 questions, please. The lady in the back in red.
Thank you. The gentleman over here made the point that even within diverse countries like the US and the UK, we have had Trump and Brexit. But I think it's worth making the point that even within supposedly diverse countries, that diversity is very localized. I'm British, and I know that London voted to remain. And we have to remember that metropolitan areas may be diverse, but there are always still vast swathes of these countries that are still not so diverse. And I think, we think here on an international level, but it's always worth remembering that there are still very much internal divides. So I was wondering, within new European countries, how much is there this internal divide between, say, urban and rural or provincial, and to what extent is that something that needs to be solved in order for these countries to move forward? How much do we think that is an issue?
Thank you very much. I think it's very true that we shouldn't think monolithically, even in these places, and I'd like to hear the colleagues on this in a moment. One final question, please, or comment? Anyone? Sir, please.
Liberal democracy?
A mic so everybody can hear you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening contributions. Different models of democracy. I think we also have to think of Rousseau, right, who was an alternative model there, which is less liberal than other visions. My question is a different one. How much do you think this disillusionment with Europe, by the new Europe, or between all and Europe, is also a disillusionment with the West as such? Is there a difference there? Should we distinguish, or is it more general disillusionment?
Thank you very much. So, Magdalena, I'm going to start with you. These 2 questions, if you care to comment, and any final comments you'd like to offer on our topic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much about the localization of diversity and the differences between urban and rural parts of society. Well, in the Polish case, it is visible, especially during the elections, that we have significant more supporters of liberal politics in big towns. But I would not absolutize this difference between the rural and urban parts of societies, and especially the problem of the wave of refugees showed us that a division between big cities and the province can be easily trespassed, and people, no matter where, from what part of the social area they come, just felt encouraged to present quite radical xenophobic opinions, also in the new media. So Facebook was full of hate speech directed towards the refugees, and also the elites, also among the well-educated people. This phenomenon was unfortunately very visible. Disillusionment with the West. Yes, it's not that simple that it's a disillusionment with a West understood as a monolith, as an entity. I think that as the politicians, conservative politicians, cannot deny that the membership in the EU gave the region the infrastructural modernization. They focus on strengthening the disillusionment with the axiological layer of the West. So Witold Morawski, a Polish economist and sociologist, said that there is no one sole West in the current public sphere in the region, and I agree with that. And the division. The first division lies between this economic layer and this axiological, which is very vulnerable for rejecting nowadays.
Thank you very much. Andrei, please.
Yes, I think there is an East European elite, which is not only urban, but in fact is a small part of the urban class. I have two examples on both sides of myself. Young people who speak very good English, often German, rarely French, who have traveled, who feel at home in Geneva or in New York or in San Francisco, as they do in Kiev or in Warsaw. But this is a very small minority, and these are the people whom we hear most. These are the people whom we are likely to invite to read and so on. And behind them, there is a very conservative mass, which, to touch upon the second question, is surprised by some attitudes in the West. And in a sense, too, we missed the moment when we could have combined the East and West European project. Valeria referred to this. In 1989, there was a great utopian moment. There was a great enthusiasm. And Brussels let it pass. It waited 15 years and more to admit the former communist countries. During that time, people had occasion to be disillusioned with the West and to forget their utopian hopes of 1989.
Thank you. Valeria, you have the last word.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that this sort of resentment is very strong, that the role of learners was imposed on Easterners, that you cannot suggest anything new, you just have to constantly catch up, that's all you can do. And this resentment has been very strong all the way, but nowadays we have also another type of disillusionment added, that there is no more safe place on earth. Because it was like, a very comforting thing that if everything runs very badly in Ukraine, you can go somewhere. And all the recent developments everywhere means that problems are everywhere, so you have to stay and settle them here, this type of... Because, when Trump was announced president-elect, the website of Canada immigration just crashed. So people are all the same everywhere. People in the US thought maybe we should immigrate to Canada. So that's a new type of disillusionment. And go back to cleavages, yes, of course, there are some, but what is important and has to be stressed in the moment that from my perspective in Ukraine, the borders now are flexible. They are to some extent situational, notwithstanding what people tend to think about Ukraine and regional divides. But
they tend to be stabilized, and once they are carved in stone, then we'll have a very polarized society, and that's a danger which is very kind of real in Ukraine. Yeah.
Thank you all three for. Did you have anything to add, André? No? Okay. Thank you for your rich analysis, for the clarity of your responses. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have, so this brings it to a close. Please join me in thanking our panelists. What time is the next session?
The next session is, I think, at 3 o'clock.
So please come back at 3 o'clock for the next session.